The mainstream media drum up a controversy about robocalls misinforming voters, but then they drop it as soon as the Liberals win the election. The Globe and Mail sheds a tear for alienated Westerners, but they also shed a tear for poor Justin Trudeau, who has to deal with that unruly bunch. And we'll highlight some of the CBC's most partisan moments from the campaign. I'm your host, Candice Malcolm, and welcome to This Week in Fake News. Hi everyone, thank you so much for tuning in this Friday. I am coming to you once again from my living room. I said last week that I was going to hopefully have my studio set up. My family just moved, so we haven't set up the office yet, haven't set up the studio. So coming to you live from the living room. I'm holding out hope though, but that we will have the office and the studio ready by next week. So I guess you'll have to tune in next week to find out. Let's get right to the most biased news stories of the week. We'll start out with election night. So I was pretty hesitant to even watch the mainstream media coverage of the election because I knew exactly what I was going to expect, especially from sort of the major players, CBC, CTV, and Global. Now, I will admit that they sort of have the best overall coverage because they have the graphics, they have the pollsters, they have, really impressive fancy sets. So it's good to kind of watch the horse race from their shows. But then you have to put up with not only the very left-wing and liberal analysis from the pundits that they have on there, but also the stories that they drum up. They always have like a token conservative on these panels, and most of the time that token conservative is just there basically apologizing for conservatives, not really like giving the conservative perspective or defending the conservative position or defending the conservative worldview, but pretty much just apologizing and admitting that conservatives are the worst. So it's just always painful to see, especially for that one conservative that just basically has to swallow their pride and seek strange new respect from all these horrible liberals. But anyway, my biggest pet peeve in election night was a story that we started, came in early. This is on CTV. They were drumming up this story of this scandal that was supposedly unfolding, and they had their top reporter, Glenn McGregor, on the case. And once again, it was like a deja vu from 2011, but it was robocalls. We were told that robocalls were providing disinformation and sending the wrong message to Canadians. And so they kept going to Glenn McGregor, who was really just drumming up this story. It was like his old story from 2011 all over again. And so here you can see he was tweeting about it. Elections Canada says it is aware of reports of people receiving robocalls with misinformation about voting day. Nova Scotia and Quebec. It knows that robocalls are allowed on E-Day and says any complaints should be made to the Commissioner of Elections Canada. So from best I could tell, this story was that of human incompetence. They were sending out robocalls on the morning of the election that said to the person who would receive the call, tomorrow's election day, don't forget to vote, this is where you can vote. And so presumably whoever's job it was to make sure that those calls all went out on Sunday night messed up, and some of them went out on Monday morning. And so what was pretty clearly just, an amateur mistake, the CTV was drumming up into this big possible scandal of misinformation deliberately being sent out to confuse Canadians. For folks who were paying attention to to Canadian politics back in 2011, remember that this was a huge, huge, huge scandal that was drummed up by the same reporter, Glenn McGregor, and one of his colleagues at the time, Steve Marr, who wrote seriously like a 50-part series on robocalls and how they supposedly influenced the election. It's one of those things that I noticed that it happened in the US when Donald Trump won his election, that liberals in the media just couldn't quite wrap their head around the idea that a conservative could win. As soon as a conservative wins or a Republican wins in the US, there has to be some explanation. It can't just be that the population and the people support the politics of that politician. There always has to be a scandal. So in the US, it was the Russia interference that they just drummed up and were so convinced that it was going to provide this whole explanation about how the election was stolen. And in Canada in 2011, it was exactly the same thing with the robocalls. The journalists couldn't accept the fact that the Conservatives were just more popular and actually won the election. So they could only explain it away by pointing at this mysterious kind of evasive campaign that must have happened where Canadians were misinformed through these robocalls. And so you saw that again unfolding. It was like they were preparing for a conservative victory, that saying like, oh, this is the real reason why Andrew Scheer might win, because obviously this campaign of misinformation. So they kept going to Glenn McGregor. He kept providing the same report. And then all of a sudden, the Liberals started winning the campaign. It was pretty clear at some point that the Liberals were going to win, and then it was announced that they'd won a minority government. And all of a sudden, they completely dropped the story. They completely dropped it. They stopped going to Glenn McGregor. They stopped asking about robocalls, and you never heard about it again. They completely dropped it. They never talked about it. Supposedly, Nova Scotia and Quebec were the places where this misinformation was going on. The Liberals did okay in those places, and wow, just like that, the story disappears. So, here's just sort of the casual bias of the mainstream media. They want to drum up stories, and then as soon as it turns out to be nothing, as soon as the Liberals win, then it turns out to be nothing. All right, let's move on. The Globe and Mail wrote an editorial that was just so annoying. Spare some sympathy for the West, but also for Justin Trudeau's Western problem. So, it's kind of interesting because the Globe and Mail endorsed the Conservatives, but you read this editorial and it's completely clear that the editorial board anyway supports Justin Trudeau. They talk about it, how they defend, how they support the carbon tax, how they thought that Premier Scott Moe's letter that he sent out was basically over the top. It was particularly, here's quoting from the piece, it was particularly off-putting to see Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe release a letter the day after the election in which he demanded the Liberals cancel the federal carbon tax, as if the winning party would ever adopt the main plank of its defeated opponent. And then, they kind of go on just saying like, oh, look at these Westerners clamoring and, making all this noise. But really, poor Justin Trudeau, because he's the guy that has to deal with this. I mean, look, the reality is that Justin Trudeau won the election by pitting Canadians against each other. He ran an incredibly divisive campaign. He picked up on the most kind of wedge issues he could find, and he ran an incredibly negative campaign. The whole idea was that he was saying in Quebec, in French, we need a Quebecer to be in office. We need someone who's going to stand up to, the rest of the country. And what he was, reading between the lines, what he was saying really was, only I can stand up to the energy industry. Only I can stand up to these loudmouth people in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And, pitting parts of the country against each other doesn't end well. And because of it, we have two separatist movements in two separate parts of the country. I mean, Trudeau barely won a minority government. He lost the popular vote. He won just sort of through holding on in strategic areas of the country, mostly in the GTA, around areas around Toronto and parts of Vancouver. And, the reality is that the Bloc Québécois and the Conservative parties both picked up the most amount of seats based on this sort of frustration in Quebec that they aren't happy with the Federation and the current situation. And in Alberta, they were completely blocked out. Liberals got no seats in either Alberta or Saskatchewan. So, yeah, it's going to be tough for Justin Trudeau to deal with this situation. I agree with the Globe in that regard. But it's of his own making. He was the one that put himself in the situation where he wedged the country against each other, where he, didn't win any seats in Alberta or Saskatchewan. So there's going to be no representation from the West in his cabinet. And, he's to blame. He's to blame. And so, no, we shouldn't shed a tear for Trudeau. We should share no sympathy for Trudeau because he has to deal with a situation that he himself created. Okay, let's move on. I want to talk about one more piece. Our friend over at Post Millennial, Graham Gordon, who used to contribute here at True North, came up with a nifty little opinion article today about the CBC and how he said that the CBC branded itself liberal during the election. Graham did a good job of just kind of going through the individual instances of, CBC's very obvious liberal bias, and I think he did a great job. So I will put a link to Graham's article in the description below, but it kind of reminded me of some of the worst instances. It was really interesting because the the last couple of days of the campaign, we saw the media really kind of losing its patience and getting incredibly frustrated with Andrew Scheer. They accused him of lying. They accused him of making things up, particularly when he mentioned that the Liberals would probably have to raise the GST in order to pay for all their promises. You basically saw them acting like political activists. Here, this isn't CBC. This is from Global. I'll play a clip of a Global host using this line of reasoning.
Mr. Scheer, when asked why you're spreading false information about your opponents, like among other false statements saying the Liberals will decriminalize hard drugs and saying the Liberals and NDP will raise GST, when they say that's a lie, you can't draw conclusions where the hard facts don't back up what you're saying. So you've explained your reasoning to Canadians. My question to you this morning is, how do you explain to your 5 children, from toddler to teenage, that it is okay to lead a dirty campaign based on information that is not entirely true and constant attacks on your opponents?
I mean, that was just sort of like unhinged, like the way that she directed that question. And I don't think Scheer handled it very well. If I was Scheer, I would have been angry. Like, how dare you invoke my children in this question? You know, why aren't you asking Justin Trudeau why he lied about SNC-Lavalin? Why aren't you asking Justin Trudeau why he lied about this, why he lied about that? You know, they jump on the Conservatives and accuse them of kind of the worst things, but then they completely ignore when the Liberals do it. And then they do it themselves. So basically, Trudeau and the Liberals created this narrative that Andrew Scheer was an extreme SoCon with a hidden agenda on gay marriage and abortion. And then they spent the entire campaign talking about that. Now, there was no shred of truth to that, in that Scheer never talked about it. Scheer never said, I'm going to legislate on these things. So when the Liberals created the idea that this was something that was happening in the background, and Scheer said, no, that's not true, then using the same standard, the Liberals, the media should have said, no, Scheer said that that's not true, let's move on, right? Because when the Conservatives accuse the Liberals of raising taxes, all the Liberals have to say is, no, that's not true. And then everyone in the media starts defending the Liberals, saying, well, no, they said they're not going to raise taxes. They said they're not going to raise taxes. They said they're not going to raise taxes. Why doesn't that same standard apply for Andrew Scheer? He said he's not going to legislate on social issues. So, you know, they put to bed immediately the idea that Trudeau's not going to raise taxes, even though any idiot can look at the government's spending promises and realize that there's no way they can afford them. And we can also look back at the last 4 years to say that the Liberals just don't keep their promises when it comes to spending and deficits, because look at the out of control deficits, and Trudeau promised that those would be gone. So, you know, there's just this complete double standard. The media are allowed to question and question and question and question and push and use hearsay and use innuendo and use rumors and unfounded rumors when it comes to Scheer and Conservatives and social issues. But if anyone does that to Trudeau, the media act as like his personal, you know, press agent, saying like, no, that's not what Trudeau believes. That's not what Trudeau said. And so, you know, we have obviously a lot of examples of that. But then there's also just a sort of uncomfortable chumminess. Remember this is from pretty early in the campaign. Justin Trudeau buys a reporter from CBC Poutine in front of all the cameras and jokes that the Liberals always support the CBC. Let's play that clip.
This is for you, David. This is for you. No, not me. Hey, Liberal Party always supports the CBC.
And Graham points out in this piece, you know, even if the CBC officially followed their own journalistic standards and practices, you know, they're supposed to avoid real or perceived conflicts of interest. So, you know, just the imagery there, the symbolism of a journalist laughing and chumming with the Liberals as they talk about how they take care of each other is just obviously not good. I won't go into the whole lawsuit thing because I spent most of the podcast talking about that last time. But, you know, there really is just example after example of the CBC showing their bias. This is just one more example that I find amusing. So I don't know if you remember, but maybe halfway through the campaign, Katie Simpson tweeted out about how Andrew Scheer just tripped walking into an event and how it was so embarrassing for him, and he's probably gonna regret it happening, especially because she assumed that the pool cameras had caught it. That there was no camera that caught it, so we don't know if Andrew Scheer actually did trip. You just have to take Katie Simpson's word for that. CBC reporter Katie Simpson. But then near the end of the campaign, Justin Trudeau actually did trip. He was walking into an event and he tripped, and it was caught on camera, and the CBC never mentioned it. So that, that's pretty minor, but still the idea that when something bad happens to Scheer, the CBC is there with a megaphone to amplify it. When something embarrassing and bad happens to Trudeau, the CBC just pretends it doesn't exist until it goes away. And that pretty much is a metaphor that sums up their coverage of the entire campaign. The only silver lining I think about it is that it was so transparent how biased they were that I think it became obvious to more and more Canadians. People who watch the news closely, people like me and people like you who watch the news closely know that the CBC is very, very biased. But maybe, the typical Canadian that doesn't consume as much political news as you or I do wouldn't know. I think more and more people became very obvious during this campaign that the CBC is just incredibly biased and act in bad faith towards Conservatives. And I think that the more people who are aware of that and who watch it and who file complaints, the better it will be, because people will either pressure the CBC into changing their practices, or people will just stop tuning in to the mainstream media, which has happened in the US, which is why it doesn't matter what CNN says about Donald Trump, because a certain segment of the population just doesn't trust the mainstream media anymore, so they don't care what CNN and others have to say. More and more people in Canada just do not care what the CBC has to say. Okay, guys, I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you so much for tuning in this week. And like I said, hopefully we'll be back up and running in our studio next week. I'm going to do another pitch for True North. We've got a lot of really great exclusive content up there. We've hired a couple more investigative journalists across the country, so we have lots of different stories that we're working on, lots of leads, and a whole bunch of really great exclusive content. So go check that out at tnc.news. All right, have a great weekend. Thank you very much.